As the Bible says, blessed are the peacemakers. And in that end, I hope my greatest legacy, when it's all finished, will be known as a peacemaker and a unifier. I hope that's going to be true.
That was President Trump at the National Prayer Breakfast this morning after he doubled down on his proposal for the U.S. to take control of Gaza and for Palestinians to be resettled. The president, writing on Truth Social, quote, the Gaza Strip would be turned over to the United States by Israel at the conclusion of fighting, and that the Palestinian people will be, quote, resettled in far safer and more beautiful communities with new and modern homes in the region. Moments ago, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu met with lawmakers on Capitol Hill, and he was asked about President Trump's proposal. Here's what he had to say.
Mr. Netanyahu, do you think it's not needed in Gaza
Are we in?
to make it feasible?
No.
Joining us now from Tel Aviv is NBC's Yasmin Masougian. Also with us, Peter Baker, New York Times chief White House correspondent and an NBC News political analyst. So, Yasmin, President Trump is making statements about Gaza as the ceasefire negotiations are trying to move to the next phase, a very delicate phase.
Yeah, incredibly delicate. While the Prime Minister is gifting President Trump with a gold pager as a reference to those surprise attacks on Hezbollah fighters, you have to understand the landscape here in Israel right now, Jose, to really see how fragile this moment is for this ceasefire deal and even getting to phase two. If you look at what's happening in the West Bank, many feeling as if the war has actually shifted to the West Bank. The continued explosions in Jenin just last weekend, 100 plus residential buildings were in fact exploded, people losing their homes, their belongings, 30,000 plus Palestinians evacuated from Jenin camp. And then you talk about the hostages, right? We're supposed to get 3 more names tomorrow, 3 more hostages released on Saturday, 79 hostages remaining in Hamas captivity. Hamas potentially wondering how they'll have the upper hand if they continue on with this ceasefire deal. And then the family forum, the family members of the hostages, incredibly worried that their family members will fall by the wayside because of this rhetoric that is coming out of Washington and from Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu and calling for Palestinians to leave Gaza. I actually sat down with Aviva Siegel, the wife of Keith Siegel, who was the first Israeli-American hostage to be released on Saturday. Aviva spent 52 days in captivity. Her husband, Keith, 484 days. And I asked her, Jose, specifically if she was worried about the fragility of this phase of the ceasefire and of bringing the hostages home. Let's take a listen to what she has to say, and then we'll talk on the other side.
I just want to tell President Trump and Bibi Netanyahu and Hamas, just let them go home. Please let them go home. They've had enough. We've had enough. Everybody in this country has had enough. And knowing and feeling what it's like on being all sides now, being a hostage, worrying for my husband that was a hostage for 484 days. And now that he's released, and I'm released in one way, knowing what they're going through, hell, just please wake up before it's too late.
Ms. LaBelle, in your testimony, you named some very key different factors in this crisis and how we can address it. First, you named transnational efforts, which I think are tremendously important, and to that extent, addressing the financial choke points that actually reward fentanyl trafficking. But then secondly, you talked about prevention and treatment. And one thing that I thought was very significant in your testimony is you naming the healthcare agencies that are responsible for helping reduce fentanyl and fentanyl use. And one of those things that you named was not just the CDC, the NIH, but you also named Medicaid. Would it be fair to say that Medicaid is actually one of the most important and strongest protections we have in the opioid crisis in the United States?
Yes. It treats a lot of people with addiction who would not otherwise be able to receive care.
And cutting off Medicaid and cutting off access to Medicaid could potentially increase the fentanyl crisis in the United States and certainly result in deaths from the fentanyl crisis?
I think it's safe to say that if Medicaid were significantly reduced, more people would die of overdoses.
So we're talking about the prospect of cutting Medicaid as exploding the fentanyl crisis in the United States. And I imagine you see in many communities where there are fentanyl, when there's widespread fentanyl use, there's also large interplays with the Medicaid system, correct?
Yes.
Can you explain that a little bit further, what you see?
So, I mean, people are, especially in Medicaid expansion states, I mean, one area that I keep bringing up, but it's so important, and we've done a lot of work on this at Georgetown, is people upon leaving incarceration are at 10 times greater risk of overdose. And so cutting off Medicaid for that population will leave them not only probably more mortality, but also increase their risk. They're just going to end up back in prison.
So one of the things you were saying, very importantly, someone leaving incarceration is at 10 times higher risk of overdose demand. And so incarcerating people too broadly can also create a demand on fentanyl because these are people who are struggling with a lot of these issues. And I think one of the things that is important for us to see here is in those threats to Medicaid, just last month in our continuing resolution, we had bipartisan efforts to address fentanyl, including expansion of Medicaid to address the fentanyl crisis treatment that the Republican majority stripped on orders of Elon Musk. People are dying because of this. And we have to make sure that we are protecting our Medicaid system, not cutting it, because cuts to Medicaid are going to expand are going to expand our fentanyl crisis. And with that, I yield back.
Stephen, you called Trump's takeover plan sheer lunacy, writing in Foreign Policy. I want to play devil's advocate here for a second and just wonder if there is maybe an alternate intention. Donald Trump helped negotiate the Abraham Accords a few years back. Is there a way to look at this as in a more generous light to say maybe he's saying this so that Saudi Arabia comes to the table and says, no, we're going to actually help with the rebuilding? Because so far the idea of rebuilding Gaza, the plan for rebuilding Gaza, non-existent. There is no plan for rebuilding Gaza. The Israelis have put nothing forward. But if this ceasefire is going to continue, there's got to be a plan at the end of the road. Saudi Arabia has said there's got to be a plan for Palestinian statehood at the end of the road if they're going to maintain normalized relations. So in a generous reading of this, can we say that this is maybe Donald Trump being at the extreme end of things to get things moving?
Well, that is really generous, Katie. I use the term sheer lunacy for a very specific reason. It's precisely because the president has a series of goals in the Middle East that makes this proposal to ethnically cleanse Gazans from the area and move them to Egypt and Jordan. It would undermine everything that he has sought to do. If you want the Saudis to play ball on Gaza, you don't threaten to move Palestinians out, take over the Gaza Strip, and quote unquote own it. That's unlikely to get the Saudis, who are reluctant, without a doubt, who are already reluctant to get involved in the Gaza Strip because it's throwing good money after that. But this is less likely to get them to do the kinds of things that he wants to do. So, whereas I have heard this generous interpretation of things, that he's just doing this so that he gets the Saudis, the Egyptians, and the Jordanians to step up. It seems to me that given the fact that transferring Palestinians to Egypt is seen as a security threat from the perspective of the Egyptian government and a threat to the stability of the kingdom in Jordan, he's less likely to get them to step up and more likely for them to say, which is essentially what they have been saying, is we're willing to risk our aid in order to oppose this plan.
I wonder about the security threat to the United States for trying to attempt something like this. The National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, was on CBS this morning. He was asked that question. Here's the answer.
From an American perspective, does this make Americans safer? The first concern people will have is, well, there's terrorism there. Is there now going to be terrorism here because we're so mixed up in this?
Well, it's the same I mean, I think it's the same strategy and thinking of why we still have forces going after ISIS all over the world. We still have allies and partners helping us with al-Qaeda. The president just authorized on Saturday a strike to a major ISIS financier, recruiter, and leader in the caves in northern Somalia that, frankly, our military have been trying to take out for well over a year and couldn't get the approvals from the previous White House. So I think what you're asking is, why do we support our allies and partners in counterterrorism with a group that is literally promising to conduct future October 7th, which was the 9/11 for Israel of their time? So absolutely, we're going to continue to help. And when we have terrorism defeated and degraded abroad, it helps the homeland here.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure that was an answer. I think the question more was, is this going to inspire more hatred toward the West? Does this unite the Middle East against the West? Is this making us safer here?
Yeah, I think the National Security Advisor, who has a good reputation, was purposely evading the question there.
Trump continues to hold rallies, guys, whether it's rallies on stage or whether he's using the Oval Office to effectively hold a political rally with Netanyahu. These are all ending in violence. Trump's policies have direct and indirect violence. And I want you to understand that Donald's moves are violent ones. Every one of them. You have the overt ones. We're going to conquer lands, ethnically cleanse people, all of that. Trump gives these speeches, holds these events, and he doubles and triples down on just destroying a people and their homeland. Imagine if somebody was like, yeah, we're going to take Florida and move all the people out of Florida and turn it into another country's playground. Rightfully, people would be like, that's violent. That's a violent speech. Right? Because to do that, you're not just going to get everyone. Death will follow. Even if not everybody, some number of people will perish because of your move. But also, like AOC exposes it there. Donald and Elon's cuts have deadly consequences. We need to understand this. This is something we let the right get away with. We let them use metaphor too much. They don't deserve it. Any cuts like this, people die. When Republicans cut healthcare, people die. And they know it, so it's violent. And this is before Trump. Mitt Romney's proposed cuts, Bush's actions, cutting all these things, trying to cut Social Security, these are policies of death and violence.